So, I try my best to work my way around a lot of different groups and forums just to get a broad idea of what's going on into the toy world. And one thing I keep running into is comments about how, hey, I buy Action Force to augment my G.I. Joes. Now, granted, there are plenty of places where, people argue about Action Force and G.I. Joe, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay, fine. We won't get into that. But when I run into those, I use Action Force to augment my G.I. Joes, which is fine. Anybody can collect how they want. I come back with, well, I actually buy classified to augment my Action Force. And I usually get a response of, huh, that doesn't work. Well, I thought I'd take a moment and do a little feature on how I do make that work. So I hope you enjoy. So I have been a G.I. Joe fan since 1982. I was a fan of the 12-inch line too. But I really got suckered in with the Real American Hero line. To me, it was that classic good versus evil. I mean, it was perfect to pick up after Star Wars ended. The line was great. It had a ton of vehicles, wonderful, wonderful characters, and probably is, if it's not my favorite toy line, it's probably number two. That said, when G.I. Joe Classified came out, I was not enamored. The Nerf light guns, the weird designs, the leaning into more sci fi, not futuristic, I mean sci fi. Emphasis on the fi part there. It just didn't appeal to me. I kind of looked away from it. As I went on, I started rebuilding my collection of Marvel Legends. Then, dramatic pause, I discovered Action Force. At first, I was kind of like, well, this is just kind of like upscale G.I. Joe. Then I got into the story of Action Force, and that won me over. A dystopian America that has fallen apart, and a British operative who decides to stay behind against orders and do the right thing and help America against New Colonia. That was appealing to me. It's that classic good guy versus bad guy stuff. The lines are a little grayer, but it still works. And as I got to know the characters like Trigger, Condor, and Eclipse, I really got won over by this. So, of course, in the process of this, I bought Sergeant Slaughter. Now, Sarge is obviously intended to be a much older Sergeant Slaughter than what we know. On Sarge's file card, there's this funny line where it talks about he was a special tactics instructor for a special missions force of the United States military, in which he served and retired in 1994. Who could that be? At that point, I had bought Storm Shadow and Spirit, two of my favorite Joes, or I should say Joe figures, that I really wanted him just to have as sort of a novelty. And I got to thinking about, wait a minute, Special Missions Unit has to be G.I. Joe. So I started looking at Spirit and thinking, I wonder if I can incorporate Spirit. And then someone made an offhanded comment about a figure, and that opened the door. Stalker. They said he looked old, and he does. I'm not going to deny it, he does. And that's perfect. Absolutely perfect. My thought was, move the timeline up a little bit. Now, when I was a kid, I always thought of the Joes as being roughly around 25 to 30 on average. Maybe Duke was 30, but most of them were in their mid 20s. You know, enough years in service to gain some experience, but still young enough to be pretty spry. So in my brain, I moved the timeline up a little bit. The Cobra conflict happened maybe a few years later than what it did for us. Well, I'll just say it that way. It was always future leaning anyway, so that didn't hurt. When Sarge joined up with Action Force, maybe he had some old contacts he could call. Some guys from that special mission team. Experts. Yeah, they'll be a little bit older. They still got a lot of expertise and still have some physical ability that they can utilize. After that, it was easy to incorporate guys like Stalker, Bazooka, Shipwreck, you name it. Now, as I was looking, I had a couple other favorites I had. Somebody like Storm Shadow. I know Bobby Valla hates ninjas in that the idea of ninjas in Action Force, but Storm Shadow, hell, he could be a mercenary, and as such, could be just taking some money from Carrick. Same thing with Copperhead and some other people like Zartan. I mean, there are ways to fit these guys in here. As I started grabbing more figures, I started thinking, okay, how can these guys fit in? I took a look at Destro and I was like, you know, Crimson Shadow is an arms dealing company, but they don't have anyone in front. Not just Destro there. Him and the Baroness could be running the company. If Val ever comes out with a personality that runs Crimson Shadow, I could just say that Destro was the face of the company and was a shell of his former self after his humiliating defeat at the hands of G.I. Joe. And this was his way to kind of gain some momentum back. Now, my difficulty in this is the army builders. How do I incorporate guys with Cobra symbols emblazoned on their uniforms? Now, I can see an argument for the bat. It's just a robot. But even still, on a best case scenario, this is going to be a 20-year-old design and still have a Cobra symbol on it. I could argue Destro has one or two lying around, but why would he? Now, maybe what I'll do is I'll say Destro pulled these out. There's a new mad scientist somewhere who came up with the idea of the Praetorian Guard based off the bat design. That could be where my headcanon goes. We'll see. Maybe it's Dr. Venom. What's cool about this is if I don't want to incorporate something from the old Joe mythos, I don't have to. I was never a big fan of Dr. Mindbender. I did have the figure. I've had his re-releases, but I've never been a huge fan of Dr. Mindbender. So when Dr. Mindbender was an exclusive, I didn't have to worry about it. I have his original figure. It's not a big deal. Serpentor with me was pushing the edge of how far you can go with the sci-fi elements back in 1986. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it. So I ignored Serpentor when he came out as well. Now, sometimes I think Hasbro hides characters behind a big paywall of the quote deluxe category. We'll put a couple more accessories in there. They won't have near as much as a Valaverse figure, and we'll call it a deluxe and charge the same price as Valaverse. To me, that's a slightly predatory practice, but I also don't have to fall for it. Because unless it's one of my absolute favorites, like Rock and Roll or Bazooka, I can just skip it. I can say they died during the Cobra Joe conflict. There. I don't have to go buy that. I don't have to have every Joe in the line. I don't have to have the Crimson Twins because honestly, the Crimson Twins work for Cobra, but they don't work for Action Force. Where would they go? I suppose one could argue that they go into Crimson Shadows, but to me, I don't think it does. Also, if Hasbro was to do an ugly design, like, I don't know, I can completely ignore it and not worry. Again, I can just pretend the character died. No issues. Back when I was a kid, I used to throw all kinds of stuff into my G.I. Joes. For instance, Leonard Core. A lot of them went into the G.I. Joes. Hell, I even used MASH action figures as medics. If it was 1/18 scale and it fit, I would make it work. See, the thing is that with G.I. Joe, I always think of it as a 1/18 scale line. That's the best one for vehicles, for world building, for everything that G.I. Joe is about. That doesn't mean G.I. Joe can't continue. That doesn't mean there isn't more to the story. But you have to change it. When you throw in Action Force, it becomes good. Now, the other side of it is you still have the problem with the Cobra Army Builders. And I bought those just because some of those were my favorites. They don't fit well with the Garrison Cavalry, and they damn sure don't fit well with the Swarm. So there's a conundrum there. I'll figure it out eventually. Don't regret buying those figures, by the way. I mean, I bought them because they were some of my faves, and I said I'll figure out how to incorporate them in Action Force somehow. And I still will. Just haven't figured it out yet. Now, Hasbro's lack of availability, they throw exclusives at stores that are going to cancel your order. Yeah, I don't have as much worry about that because I'm not a completionist when it comes to these figures. If I need to pause and wait, I can, because it's not like this is a must for me. At the same time, I do think adding this element to the Action Force enhances my experience with Action Force. Because to me, these are two different properties that have a slight relationship to them. And what I really like is having this mixed up team of old familiar characters and new vibrant characters. This is all my headcanon. There is nothing to this. I may go nowhere with this idea. It may just be something that stays in my head for the rest of my life. I have not decided. But the point is, I'm not trying to tell you guys how to collect. I'm not trying to tell you what to think. But I am trying to tell you, you don't have to stick with what the companies tell you in your mind on how you collect. Let's face it, G.I. Joe is an 80s property. It works best in the 80s. You can bump it up to the 90s, maybe even early 2000, but something changes after certain events in our history. And let's just admit, the whole idea of G.I. Joe and Cobra, it needed to evolve and change. It's not evolved and changed. It is still the same idea. Action Force is at least original. And I know some people want to say, oh, well, that blonde-haired, blue-eyed English bloke, he's airborne. Just because there's a little bit of similarity in color to their vests. Because, I always confuse blonde-haired, blue-eyed British people with Navajo people who have a different specialty. I don't know about you. This stuff can be incorporated together very easily. It's not that hard. And you can do it the other way too. It's a lot easier the other way, I admit. You have Steel Brigade as well. That's an easy connection to G.I. Joe. The Steel Brigade started in G.I. Joe. Boom. Easy. Now, how far I'm going to go with this, I don't know. I mean, I've got a lot of my favorites like Bazooka and Rock and Roll and Shipwreck and Torpedo. I'm having fun with it, and that's the whole point of this video, is to show you different ways that you can enjoy your toys that don't require any of the companies to tell you what to think. Now, some people like to do this with customization. I kind of like to do it in my brain, though. A little bit more than customization. That's not that I'm opposed to customs. I just don't do them that often because really my brain and my imagination say a whole lot more and do a whole lot more for me. All right, well, that's my explanation about Action Force and G.I. Joe Classified. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.